Our exit poll is suggesting that there will be a Conservative majority.
Questions we'd like to put to Mr. Johnson so you can hear his replies. But we can't.
Don't switch yourself!
Is the BBC in crisis?
Welcome to Question Time Election Leaders Special.
After the turbulent years of Brexit divisions and a bruising general election, the national broadcaster is under pressure, accused of bias from left and right.
No woman wants to have to take action against their own employer.
And reeling from very public battles over equal pay, Auntie's seen the link with its customer, the public, being undermined just as it faces a government that is questioning its funding model.
How long can you justify a system whereby everybody who has a TV has to pay to fund a particular set of TV and radio channels? That is the question.
I think this is a very dangerous moment for the BBC. Many voices in the Conservative Party who do not share the commitment that many of us have to public service broadcasting and the importance of the licence fee guaranteeing the BBC independence.
When the PM questions the licence fee, he's tapping into what now seems a wider feeling. Large sections of those who handed him a majority government believe the BBC has been part of the problem. Some are at the extreme fringes of the debate. But there's no doubt genuine dislike of the BBC runs wider than this. It's an existential threat Director General Tony Hall's successor will have to navigate. Negotiating the BBC's future with a government dancing to a combative beat.
The Prime Minister is with this morning. Mr.
Morning,
Johnson,
Dan.
thank you very much for spending a bit of time with us today.
Thank you very
The
much.
PM may have appeared on Breakfast TV last week, but ministers are apparently boycotting Radio 4's Today programme.
There are criticisms which my party has made of the BBC's political coverage, which I think have some validity and the BBC needs to address. In particular, I'm critical of the fact that both in the referendum and in the general election, the BBC appeared largely ignorant of a huge body of public opinion. But that is a separate matter, and it mustn't be allowed to interfere in the debate about the future of public service broadcasting generally and how you pay for it.
Do you think ministers will appear on the Today programme at some point?
I don't speak for the government.
The BBC has traditionally acted in part as a bridge between the government and the public, with a remit to be impartial, high quality and distinctive. But those core BBC values at the heart of the Royal Charter are now being challenged, not just by those who accuse the corporation of bias, but by others who say the very notion of impartiality needs to be reframed.
This is what your money is paying for the BBC.
Increasing noise about the licence fee is a sign, perhaps, that relations with viewers and listeners aren't as cemented as they once were. A recent Ofcom report into BBC News found though audiences respect the calibre of the journalism on offer, the BBC's reporting is seen as London-centric at a time when people want their stories and voices better represented.
The real challenge for the BBC is not an immediate crisis, but medium to long-term irrelevancy. Young people not coming, not having the political currency, and therefore falling out of sight. The BBC has to navigate its way and get people to fall back in love with it, and get people to fall in love with it who've maybe never been in love with it in the first place. That's the big challenge for the BBC. You know, we call it auntie, but maybe for the young generation, they don't want an auntie, they want something else. So how does the BBC make itself relevant to this younger audience, which is substantial, and in whose hands the future really lies?
Mr. Edward Heath, first may I ask you this?
Gone are the days when politicians and audiences had no choice except the BBC. With so many other media platforms, the future will be about successfully selling the notion that the corporation still has a unique role to play.
That was Katy Razzall, our political editor. Nick Watt is here. Tony Hall announcing his departure
around 10:30 this morning, Nick. Just talk us through what happened and what that means.
Well, Newsnight understands that Tony Hall had wanted to stay until 2022 for the centenary of the BBC, but after big discussions with the board, it was agreed that he would go much sooner than that. And this is being interpreted in government circles as something of a masterstroke by David Clementi, the chairman of the BBC board, because had Tony Hall waited until 2022, it would have been a new chairman of the BBC making the appointment, and that new chairman would have been appointed by Boris Johnson's government. So stealing a march on the government there, but I'm hearing that the government, the cabinet, are expecting the BBC to sound them out on this appointment of the new Director General. And what I'm hearing is that there's no appetite in the government for a sort of a BBC lifer who says, pull up the drawbridge, I'm not interested in reform. What they're saying is that the new candidate, they could be from the BBC or beyond, they've got to be, I was told, open and enthusiastic about reform, and they're looking at three particular areas in government. Firstly, the new Director General will have to be open to the idea of decriminalising non-payment of the licence fee. Secondly, the new Director General would have to think very, very carefully about BBC plans to pare back the free TV licence for over 75s. And in the third area, they would have to be open to looking at new funding models.
So how challenging is that going to be for whoever comes in? I mean, decriminalising essentially gives everyone carte blanche not to pay it, right?
Well, very challenging because, of course, during the general election campaign, Boris Johnson mused about the idea of scrapping the TV licence. And I was talking to one of his aides a few weeks after that who said to me, there are very good arguments for binning the licence fee. They object to the political reporting on the BBC. They then actually said that drama would be much, much better on the BBC if it wasn't funded centrally. But talking in the Cabinet tonight, what I'm hearing is they expect there to be a very, very big push from Downing Street for radical changes at the BBC, and then a familiar pattern will emerge. The BBC will point out what programmes will have to go, and as it was put to me, Boris Johnson will get cold feet.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now, David Dimbleby, whose career at the BBC spans, we think, about 7 decades or thereabouts, David. The writer, comedian, actress Katy Brand, and the former BBC and ITV chairman, Michael Grade, Lord Grade. Nice to see you all here. Katy referred to this as an existential threat. Michael, you must feel you can sip away if you need more water. You just sip if you're trying to get my attention. In terms of this existential threat, do you feel that you have seen them come and go? Or do you think that this is something the likes of which we haven't seen before?
I remember when Mrs. Thatcher tried to have a go at the BBC, and after she'd been in office for a bit, I asked her at a private function, you said you were going to go for the BBC, you've done nothing. And she said, which I thought was very wise, she said, rather anguished, every time I try and attack the BBC, people come out of the woodwork to defend it. And I think it's always worth remembering, even in the parlous position we're in at the moment, with a government with the arrogance of an 80 majority, thinking it can do things, it's always worth remembering that I think in the end, people trust the BBC more than they trust politicians who try to diminish it. And I'm not saying that there aren't major, major problems with the BBC at the moment. I think there are on the licence fee, on all the challenges the BBC faces, and I don't think we're necessarily yet in a position to answer those challenges. So I think there are problems ahead. But Tony revived the place after he took over in the most appalling circumstances, with the Director General who lasted only a matter of days over the Razzall crisis and all of that. And he took over, and because of his kind of passion and enthusiasm for broadcasting, I knew him when he was a news editor, his love of broadcasting, he kind of revived the place, and he's kept it going. Why he's going now, I don't know. I thought he would, as Nick was saying, wanted to stay till the centenary of the BBC, but whatever the reason, he's going, and his successor will face major challenges that are still to be answered. There always will be challenges. There are always difficulties.
Do you know why he's going, Michael? You've spoken to him recently?
Yes, I had a drink with him on Friday evening.
And he knew then he was going?
Well, he didn't confide in me, but I said to him, "You'll stay for the 100th birthday of the BBC." He said, "Well, I don't think so." He said, "The timing's all wrong. You know, because of the timing of the charter review and the licence review, it's better if I go sooner rather than later," he said. He didn't say he was leaving this week.
I think one of the interesting things, Katy, is when you look at what Nick described as pulling up the drawbridge, defending it versus a sort of a backbone to what you believe in. When you're coming to the BBC, does it feel like a different place for you to be a comedian or an actress than anywhere else?
Yeah, certainly. And I started working for the BBC when I was 18. I was a runner. I was an unpaid runner working on a comedy show at TV Centre. And I am very passionate about the BBC. I'm not employed by the BBC. I wouldn't even say the bulk of my income comes from the BBC. However, I think like a lot of people in the country, maybe quietly within themselves, actually feel, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I think, even when people say, oh, well, I don't really use the BBC, or I don't see why I should pay the licence fee. First of all, most people, or many people in this country now, have some other form of streaming subscription. And compared with any of those, the BBC is very good value. Secondly, people will say, I don't really use it, except for maybe I listen to Radio 2 Breakfast Show on my way in the morning, and I love Strictly, and I often look at the website. And actually, when you actually think about it, I think most people do use the BBC a lot. And I think, coming in here and seeing shows like Fleabag that people took a chance on Fleabag at the BBC from a little Edinburgh show, and now it's a huge success. It's just swept the board of every awards ceremony, and we still have this phenomenal creative community that the BBC is a hub for, and I think people in my business feel a great deal of affection for. Now, creatively, there have been changes. John Burt, people still talk about that, about disempowering the creatives. And I think in the future, it would be great if programme makers were empowered more to get on with what programme makers are very, very good at. However, I just think the affection I feel for the BBC is shared by many, many millions of people, and I think people will come out of the woodwork and defend it.
And yet you can have an affection and also see the need for change. And
affection's all very well. I mean, a lot of us feel affection. I'm sure you feel affection for the BBC. I was filming during the Brexit, and I had people shouting, wankers, bloody BBC, and I'd say to them, what is it? And they genuinely ferocious arguments about the way the BBC was handling Brexit. We had it over the election. We can't diminish, there's something isn't right. And I think part of it is because of the massive expansion of social media. We've seen what's happened in the States with Fox News, which has taken over and promoted Trump. And the danger of where we are now, I think, here is that, I don't know whether Michael would agree with this, but that kind of move towards, well, we know what's right and we don't care what you say. There's no such thing as objectivity. There's no such.
Well, the news is
at the
much more.
No, but news is at the very, very heart of this argument. The politicians don't really care about, the brilliance of Fleabag. Yes, I know, but the politicians are going for the jugular always, and always have done.
The big worry I have here is that there is a timetable, there is a charter in place, I think, till 2024. There is time before 2024, nearer that date, to have a review. What do we want from the BBC? What is the BBC's core purposes in the new digital world? To start talking about the future of the BBC in the aftermath of a difficult election, because all elections are difficult, and the Brexit thing and everything else, I worry greatly that the government is trying to bring all this forward and scare the BBC. I worry greatly, and I don't believe that David Clementi, the chairman of the BBC, or the board will allow the government to interfere with the appointment of the Director General. That would be crossing a line. I think that would be very, very serious.
But when the spectre is raised, Boris Johnson says the licence fee may no longer be a sustainable model, or when Andrew Bridgen says we have to be open-minded to new ways of funding. Do you explore those?
Can we discuss the funding of the BBC once we've decided what the core purposes of the BBC should be going forward? Once you know what the public... Well, there'll be a debate. There'll be a national debate. There may be an inquiry. You may have an independent panel that will come in and look at it. Once you've decided what you want from the BBC, only then can you decide how to fund it.
When was the last report on the BBC? Commission on the BBC?
Prior to the last, it was David Clementi, the present chairman, who did a report for the government prior to the recent
But
charter.
some of these things, I mean, I was rather critical of the way the last licence fee was negotiated, you know, where George Osborne went around afterwards
But it's always
saying,
been done like that, David.
I know, but should it be? I think it should be a much more open process. George Osborne's going to say, I never thought they'd accept that. I never thought they'd accept it.
There is a lot of discussion in Parliament, in the Lords and the Commons, about putting the BBC on a statutory footing, which I would oppose, because once you put legislation, put the BBC under legislation and debate and amendment in the Commons and the Lords, you don't know what legislation is going to come out the other end.
I'm going to quote you, Michael, to Katy, because I think it was you that says it's the BBC that keeps the rest of the industry honest. Do you see the BBC as having a butterfly effect on the rest of the creative industries, or is it a beer moth which flattens everything else that people are trying to do?
No, I don't think, well, certainly I can only speak from the kind of creative side. I understand that the news element of it is a huge debate, that perhaps that has been where the focus, where things have gone quite a little awry. But I think from a creative point of view, in terms of drama, comedy, you know, even documentaries, I think, you know, all of us are freelance and we're all just sort of going around picking up work wherever we can. And I think this sense that the BBC is always trying to make good quality stuff, I think that is always the sense when you walk into this building or any BBC building, you feel that you're surrounded by people who could be making more money in the commercial sector, who have chosen to work in the BBC because there's a sense that the BBC makes good stuff, whether that's Fleabag, People Just Do Nothing, Strictly Come Dancing.
The creative industry.
There's a quality
but that
to
doesn't spread. I mean, when you're talking about news and you described what people were saying when they disagreed with the broadcasting position, the sense now is that broadcasting thinks it's mainstream, it thinks it's centrist, and actually maybe we are fractured. Maybe there are people who believe very strongly that aren't centrist, and the BBC only ever sort of tries to find
Well, I mean, you and I would believe, I think, that we can do a proper job not by being partisan, but by listening to voices, by reflecting voices in the country, and that we can go on doing that job in an honourable way.
But you have to be honest, David. I mean, you know, your last few years on Question Time will have shown you a very different kind of audience. And there are many people in this country now who don't think they're reflected, who don't see themselves on the BBC, who don't feel that it speaks to them, whether it's politically, whether it's aligned, whether it's their interests.
But that's because people have become increasingly partisan, isn't it?
Or class,
that's the danger.
or race, or colour.
And I think one of the things we have to be very careful about is sort of pandering to that by creating artificial conflict politically, deliberately trying to create, you know...
And do you feel that's what's happening at the moment?
I think there's a danger of it. I think there's a danger of that. I mean, I think, you know, you can't go back to the 1950s, but I mean, I take politicians as well in this. There was a tradition, and Robin Day was, to me, is the kind of lodestar of political interviewing. Really, really good interviewer. Began the business of politicians taking the interviewer seriously and the interviewer taking the politicians seriously. And I weep when I see a Prime Minister only appearing on breakfast television and refusing to let his cabinet ministers go on the Today programme. I think that's a diminution of democratic responsibility. It does democracy down. And people like you, who night after night sit in this studio, you do your damnedest to be fair, to listen to every voice. And I think we just have to go on doing that. I mean, we're faced with incredible problems from social media.
But this isn't just about the politicians, is it? It's not just about the politicians. It's people who feel that the BBC doesn't reflect them enough. Now, do you agree that this is something...
Do you think that's the case for people watching Strictly Come Dancing or listening to the Radio 2 breakfast show? Or the BBC
I guess the question is how much of it do they have to enjoy and like for it to be worth the licence fee?
If you go back to the Thatcher revolution, I call it a revolution, the BBC missed it completely. The BBC journalism missed the mood change in the politics in this country. There's no question about that.
Panorama got it right. A left-wing producer on Panorama, and I did the report, was the first person to take seriously Keith Joseph, Hayek and Milton
Unfortunately,
Schulman.
Nobody else at the BBC watched it.
It was watched
they wouldn't have missed
it was watched by 8 million people.
Yeah.
So
no, but I'm talking about the
slow,
political mood to shift.
No,
The political sands are changing in this country, and they certainly changed dramatically after the election. The BBC will catch up, and they'll reflect that in their journalism. What we want the BBC to be is the bulwark and the gold standard of journalism
And
in this
how
country.
hard a battle do you think that's going to be with an incoming government that you know has characters in it that don't really like the idea of a licence fee, and they call it a poll tax?
No Prime Minister in any of our lifetimes, and some of you have got longer to go than I have, is going to want to go down in history as the person who destroyed the BBC.
I think we have to be fleeter of foot. I think we're a bit plodding at the moment. I think our response to social media has not been necessarily as imaginative as it could be. I think there's a whole raft of people under the age of 30 who don't actually get a lot of what the BBC does.
Katy, what do you do with that? When you have young people that don't watch, do you say, well, just wait for the young people to get older?
No, but I'm not sure it's entirely accurate to say young people don't watch. What young people don't necessarily watch is linear TV in the sense that we understand it. But I know lots of young people who will watch something like Will I Lie to You and won't necessarily even know that it's on the BBC.
Right.
But they will hoover up episode after episode. So to define the BBC only by its success as a news organisation, I think is slightly missing the bigger picture.
But can you
and
do news so that it appeals to those people?
Yes,
That's
but
the
I think
question.
it does appeal.
Or is it at the moment a bit ponderous and a bit pompous?
The news?
Yes. I think it is.
Yes, but
I think it needs a radical rethink and a reform.
In terms of the news, I agree, but I do think it's worth just sitting here and defending the creative, the drama, the comedy,
I agree with
all of that, because that is also part of the
ponderous
BBC.
is also about accountability. You slow down when you want to get things right. It's much easier to do clickbait, to reel things off, and to know that people might prefer it and it might be wrong.
There is a very, very big debate to be had in the next 5 years about what we want from the BBC, what we don't want to lose from the BBC, what we can lose from the BBC in the new age of digital plenty. And that's a debate that's a very healthy debate, and we'll get through that. The time to have it is in a few years' time, not after an election.
But we've got the centenary coming up, and the whole BBC's history will be up for examination, and where we've got to and where we should go to. It'll be a national debate, I think.
Thank you all very much.
And we need that.
Thank you very much indeed.